Lorenzo Moretti could order a hit with a whisper, but he couldn't give his son a single second of sight. He'd spent a fortune on doctors who lied and specialists who failed. But when a black single mother with a combat medic's past steps in front of his bodyguards in a grocery store, she doesn't see a mafia boss. She sees a medical mystery that could get her killed or give a blind boy the world. One choice, one miracle, total chaos. For 10 years, the boy lived in a world of absolute shadows. Every world-renowned surgeon, every high-priced clinic from Milan to Chicago said the same thing. Nothing can be done. His father spent millions, threatened the best medical minds on the planet, and flew across 3 continents. They all just shook their heads. Then, a black single mother in a neighborhood grocery store noticed one tiny detail everyone else was too qualified to see. And what she did for that child will leave you breathless. Lorenzo Moretti was a ghost, the kind of man whose name was a death sentence if whispered in the wrong alley. An Italian mafia boss with a Chicago empire built on blood and iron. He had private estates, an army of soldiers, and more power than most men see in 100 lifetimes. But his son, Leo, was born blind. 10 years old, and he'd never seen the sun. Lorenzo tried everything. Experimental trials in Switzerland, private clinics in Rome, specialists who charged $50,000 just to walk through the door, scans, tests, surgeries. They all gave the same verdict: irreversible. Accept the darkness. But Lorenzo couldn't accept it, because Leo was the only piece of his heart he had left. His wife had died bringing that boy into the world, so Lorenzo kept fighting, kept spending, and kept breaking the hands of anyone who told him no. What he didn't know was that the answer wasn't coming from a billionaire's lab. It was coming from a stranger he'd usually walk right past. A woman buying milk on a rainy Tuesday evening. Tasha Miller was a widow, 34 years old, a former combat medic who now spent her days as a pediatric nurse. She was just a single mother trying to build a future for her 11-year-old son, Andre. But Tasha had good eyes. She noticed something about Leo, that every specialist had missed something hidden deep behind his temple, something dark and pressing. And right there, in the middle of a grocery aisle, with stone-faced bodyguards closing in, and a lethal father just steps away, she made a choice that would either restore a child's sight or cost Tasha her life. What happened next? You need to see this for yourself. Before we go deeper into the Moretti estate, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me in the comments where are you watching from. I believe this story of a miracle in the dark found you for a reason. The Moretti estate sat like a stone crown atop the hills outside Chicago. From the iron gates, it looked like a monument to power bulletproof glass, sweeping marble, and security details on every perimeter. But inside, the air was heavy. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the suffocating weight of a tomb. Men in dark suits moved through the halls like shadows, their footsteps silent on the expensive rugs. They knew the rules. Mr. Moretti didn't tolerate noise. No music played, no laughter echoed, just the cold, sharp silence of a man who was drowning in his own guilt. The Moretti estate didn't just sit on the edge of Lake Michigan. It loomed over it like a silent limestone predator. To the outside world, it was a masterpiece of Italian architecture, all sweeping arches and bulletproof glass. But inside, it was a tomb of high-end silence. There was no music in these halls, no television static, no casual chatter between the men in dark suits who stood like statues at every door. Lorenzo Moretti didn't tolerate noise, because noise was a distraction, and distraction was a weakness he couldn't afford while he was drowning in his own skin. Lorenzo stood in the center of his study, his silhouette tall and lethal against the backdrop of the gray Chicago skyline. He was a man built of sharp edges and expensive wool, his presence alone enough to lower the temperature in the room. He reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering over a photograph on his mahogany desk. Isabella. She was laughing in the picture, her dark curls caught in a breeze that seemed to blow from a different lifetime. Between them stood Leo, just a few weeks old, his eyes wide and unfocused. Lorenzo's chest tightened a familiar, jagged pain. He had spent 10 years trying to buy back the light that had gone out of his life the moment Isabella's heart stopped. Leo was 10 now. He was a boy composed of soft whispers and tactile memories, moving through the marble halls with a hand trailing along the wainscoting. He had been born into a world where the sun was just a warmth on his skin, never a sight for his eyes. Lorenzo had spent a king's ransom millions that could have bought a small country on the greatest medical minds in existence. He had flown Leo to Zurich in the middle of the night, threatened surgeons in Tokyo who dared to speak the word impossible, and sat through hundreds of hours of jargon-heavy explanations. The verdict was always the same: congenital blindness. The optic nerve was a dead wire. Accept it, Mr. Moretti, a Swiss specialist had told him, his voice trembling under Lorenzo's icy stare. God has closed these windows. Lorenzo had nearly broken the man's jaw. He didn't believe in a God who closed windows. He believed in a world that demanded payment for blood. Every time he looked at his son's vacant, beautiful eyes, he saw a receipt for his own sins. He was the capo of Chicago, a man who could make heads of state disappear with a phone call. Yet he couldn't grant his son the simple mercy of seeing a sunset. The helplessness was a slow-acting poison, eating him from the inside out, turning his grief into a cold, dangerous rage that kept the world at bay. He walked toward Leo's room, his footsteps heavy. He found the boy sitting on the edge of his bed, his head tilted in that strange, rhythmic way he'd developed lately. Leo was rubbing his right temple, his small face pinched in a mask of silent endurance. Lorenzo felt a surge of protective agony. He knelt before his son, taking the boy's small hand in his. "Does it hurt again, Leo?" Lorenzo's voice was a low rumble, the only time it ever softened. "The stinging bees are back, Papa," Leo whispered, his voice small and hollow in the vast, silent room. "They're humming louder today." Lorenzo pulled his son into his chest, the scent of expensive soap and old wood smoke clinging to them both. He looked around the room, the silk sheets, the custom-built furniture, the high-tech sensors, and felt the crushing weight of his own failure. All this gold, and his son was still being stung by shadows. He didn't know that miles away, in a world of cramped apartments and double shifts, a woman was waking up who would see what his millions had ignored. He didn't know that the light he'd been chasing across 3 continents was currently sitting in a beat-up sedan, heading toward a grocery store on the south side. Tasha Miller didn't have time for the luxury of silence. Her world was a cacophony of alarms, hospital monitors, and the constant, rhythmic heartbeat of a city that never cared if she was tired. She was a woman of striking, grounded beauty, her skin the color of deep mahogany, her eyes sharp and obsidian, holding the weary wisdom of a woman who had seen the worst of humanity in combat zones and pediatric wards. She moved with a purpose that was both fluid and fierce, a byproduct of her years as a combat medic where seconds were the difference between life and a body bag. She adjusted the stethoscope around her neck, her mind already on the grocery list she had to tackle before her next shift. Being a single mother to an 11-year-old like Andre required the precision of a military operation. Her husband had been a firefighter, a man who ran into the fire while everyone else ran out. And Tasha had carried that torch since the day he didn't come home. She didn't believe in miracles. She believed in observation, intervention, and the steady hand of someone who refused to look away. It was a Tuesday, the sky over Chicago, a bruised purple, leaking a cold, thin rain. Tasha was in the local grocery store, the kind of place where people kept their heads down and their carts moving. She was debating the price of oranges when the atmosphere in the aisle shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a sudden, localized pressure. 3 men in dark, tailored suits moved into the aisle, their eyes scanning the shelves with a clinical, lethal intent. And then, there was him. Lorenzo Moretti didn't belong in a neighborhood grocery store. He looked like an apex predator who had accidentally stepped into a cage of sheep. He was tall, his presence demanding an immediate, instinctive retreat from everyone around him. But it was the boy at his side that caught Tasha's breath. Leo walked with his hand firmly in his father's, his dark glasses hiding his eyes. But his body language spoke a language Tasha knew by heart. She watched them, her cart forgotten. Lorenzo was on a phone, speaking in a low, dangerous Italian that made the air feel heavy. He was distracted, his eyes focused on the far wall, oblivious to the way the boy's head was tilting. Leo winced a sharp, micro-expression of agony and his hand went to his temple, rubbing in a small, circular motion. Tasha's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd seen that wince before. It wasn't in the eyes. It was the way the facial muscles pulled toward the orbital bone. In the desert of Iraq, she had treated a soldier with a hidden, calcified cyst that everyone thought was a traumatic brain injury. It wasn't blindness. It was pressure. "Andre, stay right here," she whispered to her son, her voice tight. "Mom, look at those guys," Andre whispered back, his eyes wide. "They have guns under their coats." "I know," Tasha said, her medic's brain overriding her survival instinct. "I'll be right back." She stepped into the center of the aisle. Immediately, 2 of the guards moved. They didn't draw weapons, but their posture was a clear promise of violence. They blocked her path, their faces like granite. Lorenzo stopped mid-sentence, his phone still at his ear. He turned his head slowly, his icy gaze landing on Tasha. It was a look that usually made men beg for mercy. Tasha didn't blink. She was a black woman in a world that often tried to make her invisible. But standing before the most dangerous man in the city, she felt a strange, burning clarity. She looked past the guards, straight into Lorenzo's soul. "Your son," she said, her voice steady and clear, ringing out in the hushed aisle. "He isn't blind. He's being crushed." The guards moved to grab her arm, but Lorenzo raised a single hand. The movement was small, but the effect was absolute. The guards froze. Lorenzo hung up the phone, his eyes narrowing as he stepped toward her. He was close enough now that she could smell the expensive tobacco and the scent of rain on his coat. He was terrifyingly handsome, a man carved out of obsidian and sin. "You have 5 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have my men remove your tongue," Lorenzo whispered, the threat as cold as the Chicago wind. "I'm a combat medic and a nurse," Tasha said, her voice never wavering. "I've spent 10 years looking at people the world gave up on. Those specialists you hired? They looked at his optic nerve. They didn't look at the orbital canal. Look at the way he's tilting his head. Look at the distended vein at his temple. He has a blockage, a cyst from birth, that's putting so much pressure on the nerve it's mimicking blindness. If you don't relieve that pressure, he's going to have a stroke before the month is out." Lorenzo stared at her, his expression unreadable, but his hand tightened on Leo's. For a moment, the grocery store vanished. There was only the Mafia boss, the medic, and the silent boy between them. "Papa," Leo whispered, his voice trembling as he reached toward Tasha's voice. "The lady. She sounds like the light feels." Lorenzo's face shattered for a fraction of a second, a crack in the limestone fortress. He looked at Tasha, really looked at her, seeing the strength in her shoulders and the defiance in her eyes. He saw a woman who wasn't afraid of him, because she was more concerned with the child in his hand. "If you are wrong," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, vibrating growl of warning and desperation, "there is no place on this earth you can hide from me, but if you can make him see." He trailed off, the weight of 1,000 prayers hanging in the air. "I'm not wrong," Tasha said, her gaze locked on his, "but we have to move. Now." Lorenzo signaled his men. The ghost of Chicago was no longer hiding. He turned back to Tasha, a dark, magnetic tension pulling between them, a recognition of 2 souls who lived in the line of fire. "My car is outside. You're coming with us." Tasha didn't hesitate. She grabbed Andre's hand and followed the Mafia boss into the rain, stepping out of her life and into a world where the only thing more dangerous than the shadows was the man who ruled them. The black SUV sped through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago, moving like a silent bullet through a city that had no idea its king was trembling. Inside the leather-bound sanctuary of the vehicle, the air was thick with a tension so sharp it felt like a blade against the skin. Tasha sat pressed against the door, her arm protectively draped over Andre, who was staring out the tinted window with wide, terrified eyes. Opposite them sat Lorenzo Moretti. He was a statue of dark intentions, his hands resting on his thighs, his knuckles white. Between them, Leo sat perfectly still, his small head leaning toward Tasha as if she were a magnetic north he'd just discovered. Tasha's heart was a drum in her chest, but her hands remained steady. She watched Lorenzo. Up close, the man was a force of nature. His suit was worth more than her annual salary, but the grief radiating off him was a universal currency she recognized all too well. He wasn't just a monster. He was a father who had been lied to by every man with a degree. She could see the conflict in the set of his jaw, the desperate hope fighting against the instinct to eliminate any threat to his control. "You realize," Lorenzo said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very frame of the car, "that if you are playing a game with my son's life, there is no corner of this earth where the shadows won't find you. I have dismantled men for far less than the insult of a false hope." Tasha tilted her head, her obsidian eyes meeting his icy blue ones without a flicker of fear. "I've had men point rifles at my head while I was stitching their friends back together in the middle of a sandstorm, Mr. Moretti. Threats don't change the anatomy of your son's skull. You can kill me after I'm done if it makes you feel powerful. But right now, you're going to listen to me. His time is running out." Lorenzo's eyes flared not with anger, but with a reluctant, burning respect. He wasn't used to being spoken to as an equal, let alone by a woman who looked like she could hold up the sky with her bare hands. He looked at Tasha, noting the strength in her mahogany features, the way she didn't shrink under his shadow. She was a warrior in a different uniform, and for the first time in 10 years, Lorenzo felt the icy grip of despair loosen just a fraction. The car swept through the iron gates of the Moretti estate, the tires crunching on gravel. The fortress of shadows was even more imposing at night. Armed men stood at every corner, their silhouettes jagged against the floodlights. As they stepped into the foyer, the opulence was staggering marble floors that mirrored the vaulted ceilings, gold leafing that caught the dim light. But Tasha only had eyes for the boy. "I need a clean room," Tasha commanded, her voice shifting into the authoritative tone of a head nurse. "High-intensity lighting, sterile saline, and the surgical kit I saw your private doctor carrying, and I need everyone who isn't assisting to stay back. That includes your guards," Lorenzo signaled to his lead man, a scarred veteran who looked ready to protest. "Do as she says. Bring Dr. Bianchi. If he questions her, tell him his pension depends on his silence." They moved into a private medical wing that was better equipped than most city hospitals. Dr. Bianchi, a silver-haired man with shaking hands, watched in stunned silence as Tasha began to prep. She scrubbed in, her movements rhythmic and practiced. She looked over at Andre, who was sitting in a chair in the corner under the watchful eye of one of Lorenzo's kinder-looking associates. "Stay brave, baby. Mom's just doing her job." Lorenzo stood at the head of the bed, his presence a dark sun. He watched Tasha's every move. She was methodical, her focus so intense it seemed to create a vacuum around the table. She began to talk to Leo, her voice dropping into a soft, melodic cadence that seemed to soothe the boy's trembling. "Leo, I'm going to use some warm water to help those stinging bees go away," she whispered, her hands moving with the grace of a pianist. "It's going to feel like a little bit of pressure. And then, it's going to feel like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. Can you be my brave soldier?" "Yes, ma'am," Leo whispered, his small hands gripping the edge of the table. The room grew deathly quiet. Even the machines seemed to hush. Tasha began the irrigation, her eyes fixed on the small, distended area near Leo's tear duct. This wasn't a standard surgery. It was a field-expedient maneuver, a desperate gamble based on a medic's intuition. She worked the saline into the orbital canal, her fingers sensing the resistance of the calcified mass that had been strangling Leo's sight since his first breath. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes. Lorenzo didn't move. He didn't even seem to breathe. His gaze was locked on Tasha, on the sweat, beating on her dark forehead, on the steady pulse in her neck, on the way her hands never wavered, even as she defied every medical expert he had ever hired. He felt a strange magnetic pull toward her, a mixture of intense desire for her success and a raw, primal attraction to her strength. She was the light entering his dark world, and he didn't know whether to worship her or fear her. Suddenly, there was a soft, wet click. Tasha let out a breath she'd been holding for a decade. A small, dark, pebble-like mass flushed out into the sterile tray. The distended vein at Leo's temple instantly began to recede. The physical curse that had haunted the Moretti bloodline was lying in a tray of salt water. "It's gone," Tasha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She began to wrap Leo's eyes in soft gauze, her touch as light as a feather. "We have to keep the light out for a few minutes, Leo. Your eyes haven't seen the world yet. We have to let them wake up slowly." Lorenzo stepped forward, his hand reaching out instinctively toward Tasha. He stopped just short of touching her, his fingers hovering near her arm. The air between them was electric, charged with the relief of a miracle and the dangerous spark of two worlds colliding. "Is it done?" Lorenzo asked, his voice cracking for the first time in his adult life. "It's done," Tasha said, turning to face him. She was exhausted, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, but she looked like a queen in her scrubs. "In 10 minutes, you're going to find out if I'm the woman who saved your son, or the woman you're going to kill." Lorenzo looked at her at the defiance, the beauty, and the pure, unadulterated heart of the woman who had done what millions of dollars couldn't. He realized then that no matter what happened when the bandages came off, he was already a different man. The Iron Boss had been melted by a single mother from the South Side. "Wait," Lorenzo whispered, his hand finally closing over hers. His grip was firm, but not aggressive. It was the grip of a drowning man finding a lifeline. "Whatever happens next. Thank you, Tasha. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." In the heart of the Moretti fortress, the morning was about to break. Tasha stood her ground, her hand in the palm of the most dangerous man in Chicago, waiting for the shadows to finally, mercifully, retract. The medical wing felt like the inside of a vacuum, the air pressurized and thin. 10 minutes had passed, the longest 10 minutes of Lorenzo Moretti's violent, storied life. He stood at the foot of the bed, his broad chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged increments. He didn't look like a kingpin now. He looked like a man standing before a firing squad, waiting for the final command. His eyes were fixed on Tasha, who stood over Leo, her steady mahogany hands poised over the knots of the gauze. Tasha felt the heat of Lorenzo's gaze, a physical weight on the back of her neck. She knew that if she peeled back these bandages and the boy remained in darkness, her life and perhaps Andre's would be forfeit. But as she looked at Leo's relaxed facial muscles, the absence of that rhythmic, pained twitch, she felt a surge of professional certainty. She leaned down, her lips brushing Leo's forehead. "It's time, Leo," she whispered, her voice like velvet against the clinical silence. "I want you to keep your eyes closed at first. Just feel the air on your skin. When I say so, you open them very, very slowly, like a flower waking up in the morning." "I'm ready, Tasha," Leo said, his voice stronger than it had been in the grocery store. Tasha began to unwind the gauze. The fabric made a soft, rasping sound against the silence. 1 layer, 2, 3. As the last strip fell away, Tasha stepped back, clearing the path between father and son. She looked at Lorenzo, her eyes offering a silent, steady anchor. "Open them, Leo," she commanded softly. The boy's eyelashes flickered. He squeezed them shut once, twice, and then, with a sharp intake of breath, his lids parted. For the first time in 10 years, the clouded, vacant rolling of his pupils had stopped. They were clear, deep brown, and suddenly, they focused. Leo gasped, his hands flying up to cover his mouth. He looked at the high-intensity surgical lights, blinking rapidly as his brain struggled to process a decade's worth of sensory data in a single second. "Papa?" Leo's voice was a ragged sob. Lorenzo moved then, a blur of motion that lacked all his usual calculated grace. He was at the bedside in a heartbeat, his large, scarred hands framing Leo's face. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat was constricted by a grief that was being forcibly evicted by a miracle. "Look at me, Leo," Lorenzo choked out. Leo's eyes traveled up the expensive wool of the suit, past the sharp jawline, and landed squarely on Lorenzo's face. The boy's lip trembled. He reached out a small, hesitant hand, his fingers grazing Lorenzo's cheek, tracing the path of a stray tear. You look like the sun, Papa." Just like Tasha said, Lorenzo Moretti, the man who had ordered the destruction of entire dynasties without blinking, collapsed. He sank to his knees by the medical bed, burying his face in his son's small lap, his shoulders racking with heavy, silent sobs. The room seemed to expand with the sheer force of his release. Tasha stood back, her eyes wet, her hand finding Andre's shoulder. She had seen men saved on the battlefield, but she had never seen a soul return to its body until this moment. Lorenzo finally looked up, his face raw and exposed. He turned his gaze toward Tasha. The cold, predatory ice in his eyes had melted, replaced by a burning, molten intensity that made Tasha's breath hitch. It wasn't just gratitude. It was a sudden, primal recognition of the woman who had walked into his fortress of shadows and demanded the light. "You did it," Lorenzo whispered, his voice thick with wonder. "You actually did it." Tasha wiped a stray tear from her cheek, her voice regaining its professional edge even as her heart hammered. "I told you, Mr. Moretti. I don't lie about my patients." The sun began to bleed over the Chicago skyline, casting long amber shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Moretti study. The atmosphere had shifted from the clinical tension of the medical wing to a strange, heavy intimacy. Leo was asleep in the next room, exhausted by the sheer sensory overload of seeing the world, guarded by Andre and a rotation of confused but loyal soldiers. Lorenzo stood by the mahogany bar, pouring 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass. He didn't offer her a drink. He knew she was still in medic mode. He turned to face Tasha, who was sitting on the edge of a leather armchair, her posture still guarded, her dark skin glowing in the morning light. She looked out of place in the room's masculine opulence, yet she was the only thing in the room that felt real. Lorenzo walked toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. He set a heavy, silver-latched briefcase on the coffee table between them. With a flick of his thumbs, the lid popped open. Inside were neat, banded stacks of $100 bills, more money than Tasha would earn in 3 lifetimes. "This is just a beginning," Lorenzo said, his voice returning to its low, authoritative rumble, though the edge was gone. "I will set up a trust for your son. I will buy you the house you want, in whatever city you feel safe. You will never have to work a double shift again. You saved my legacy, Tasha." My life belongs to you." Tasha looked at the money. She thought about the hole in her roof, the mounting bills, and the college fund for Andre that currently sat at 3 figures. Then she looked at Lorenzo. She saw the way he was watching her as if he expected her to grab the cash and run, like everyone else in his world. "Close the box, Lorenzo," she said quietly. Lorenzo froze. "It isn't enough? Tell me the number. I don't care about the cost." Tasha stood up, her eyes flashing with a sudden, sharp pride. She stepped toward him until she was inches from his chest, forcing him to look down at her. "I didn't step in front of your guards because I wanted a paycheck. I did it because your son was in pain and no one was listening. You want to pay me? You want to settle the debt? Anything," Lorenzo whispered, captivated by the fire in her gaze. "Then be the father he deserves to see," Tasha said, her voice a low, fierce command. "He has eyes now, Lorenzo. He's going to see the blood on your hands. He's going to see the fear in the eyes of your men. If you want to thank me, don't give me a briefcase of blood money. Give that boy a father who doesn't live in a tomb." The silence that followed was deafening. Lorenzo stared at her, stunned. In his world, everything had a price. Loyalty, silence, life itself. It was all transactional. But this woman, this beautiful, defiant stranger, was looking at him and demanding the one thing he didn't know how to give: his humanity. He reached out, his hand hesitating before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a searing contrast to the coldness of his life. Tasha didn't pull away. She felt the raw, dangerous pull of the man, the darkness that still simmered beneath his skin, and the desperate, aching need for redemption that she had accidentally uncovered. "You are a dangerous woman, Tasha Miller," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intimate register. "Not because you know how to use a needle, but because you see things that should stay hidden. Maybe they stayed hidden because no one was brave enough to look," she countered, her heart racing as his thumb traced the line of her jaw. Lorenzo leaned in, his forehead resting against hers for a fleeting, heavy second. "I cannot change who I am overnight. The world I built doesn't let go that easily. But for you, and for him, I will try to find a different way to rule." He stepped back, the mask of the capo sliding back into place, but the crack remained. He signaled to his men. "Prepare the cars. Miss Miller and her son are going home. And ensure a permanent detail is stationed at her house. Not to watch her, to protect her. If so much as a shadow touches her door without her permission, I want heads." Tasha walked toward the door, stopping to look back at the man standing in the center of his golden cage. She knew their lives were now irrevocably braided together. She had given his son sight, and in return, he had given her a glimpse into a world of power and peril she wasn't sure she was ready for. Tasha stepped out into the Chicago morning. The rain finally stopped. She had brought light into the house of Moretti, but as she felt Lorenzo's gaze following her, she realized the shadows were far from gone. The miracle was over, but the story, the dark, complicated dance between the medic and the ghost, was only just beginning. The south side of Chicago felt smaller, quieter, and somehow more fragile after the marble halls of the Moretti estate. Tasha sat at her small kitchen table, the chipped formica, a stark reminder of the world she actually belonged to. Andre was asleep in the next room, finally succumbing to the exhaustion of a night that had felt like a fever dream. The air in the apartment was thick with the scent of lavender cleaner, and the distant siren of an ambulance sounds of her reality. But her mind was still trapped in that limestone fortress, haunted by the memory of a man who looked like sin and smelled like redemption. She looked at her hands. They were still steady, but she could feel the phantom heat of Lorenzo's touch on her skin. He wasn't just a man, he was a storm, and she had walked right into the eye of it. A knock at the door, soft but insistent, made her heart leap into her throat. She didn't check the peephole. She knew the rhythm of that knock. It was the sound of a man who didn't ask for entry, but expected it. She opened the door to find Lorenzo standing in the dimly lit hallway. He had shed the suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. He looked less like a king and more like a predator seeking shelter. Behind him, 2 shadows in suits stood at the end of the hall, turning her apartment building into a temporary outpost of the Moretti Empire. "You shouldn't be here, Lorenzo," Tasha whispered, her voice a mix of exhaustion and a sudden, treacherous heat. "I tried to stay away," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to fill the narrow doorway. I tried to sit in that house and watch my son sleep, but the silence was too loud. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw you standing in that aisle, looking at me like I was nothing more than a man with a broken heart. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his presence instantly making the small kitchen feel claustrophobic. He looked around the room, the faded photographs, the stack of bills on the counter, the single wilted rose in a bud vase. It was a life of struggle, yet it held a warmth his palace lacked. He turned back to her, his gaze intense, searching. "You refused the money," he said, stepping closer until Tasha could feel the heat radiating from his body. "In my world, everyone takes. Everyone has a price. But you gave me back my son and asked for nothing but a version of myself I'm not sure exists." Tasha didn't back down. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "Maybe that's because you've spent too much time surrounded by people who are afraid to tell you the truth. Money can buy a lot of things, Lorenzo. It can buy silence, it can buy power, and it can buy doctors who are too scared to admit they're wrong. But it can't buy a father's soul. You owe me a debt, yes, but you don't pay it with cash. You pay it with how you treat that boy now that he can see you." Lorenzo reached out, his fingers grazing the mahogany of her arm, his touch a searing brand. "And what if I want to pay it differently? What if the debt I feel isn't just for Leo?" The air between them turned electric, a dark romance tension that threatened to pull them both under. Tasha felt the danger of him, the violent world he inhabited, the blood that would always be on his hands. But she also felt the raw, aching vulnerability of the man who had knelt at her feet. She was a medic. She was trained to find the wound, and Lorenzo Moretti was one giant, walking injury. "I'm not one of your girls, Lorenzo," she whispered, though her breath hitched as his hand moved to the nape of her neck. "I don't play games with ghosts. I'm not playing," he growled, his face inches from hers. "I've spent 10 years in the dark, Tasha. You're the first thing I've seen that makes me want to stay in the light." The peace of the morning was shattered by a phone call that changed the frequency of the room. Lorenzo's phone buzzed on the Formica table, the vibration sounding like a rattlesnake. He answered it, his expression hardening back into the iron boss in a heartbeat. Tasha watched the transition with a sinking heart. The man who had been leaning into her space, seeking warmth, vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating commander. "When?" Lorenzo asked, his voice a flat, lethal monotone. "Tell the men to hold the perimeter. Do not move until I arrive." He hung up and looked at Tasha. The intimacy of the moment was gone, replaced by the grim reality of his life. "There has been an incident at one of the docks. Someone is testing the waters now that they think I'm distracted by my son's recovery." "Is it safe?" Tasha asked, her nurse's instinct for safety clashing with the sudden fear she felt for him. "Safe is a word for people who don't have empires," Lorenzo said, reaching for his jacket. He stopped at the door, looking back at her. The desire was still there, flickering beneath the surface of his professional coldness. "I have left 4 men downstairs. They will follow you to the hospital. They will watch your son at school. Do not argue with me on this, Tasha. You saved the most valuable thing I own. That makes you a target." "I don't want your protection, Lorenzo. I want my life back," she countered, though she knew the futility of the words. "Your life changed the second you touched my son," he said, his gaze lingering on her lips. "You're part of the Moretti story now, whether you want to be or not." He left as quickly as he had arrived, leaving the apartment feeling cold and empty. Tasha spent the day at the hospital in a daze, her eyes constantly drifting to the 2 men in suits standing by the vending machines at the end of the hall. She felt like a prisoner in a golden cage, her every move monitored by a man who was currently waging a war on the docks of Chicago. By the time she got home, the news was already buzzing. A warehouse fire, a territorial dispute. To the public, it was just another night in the city. To Tasha, it was a reminder of the blood that funded the miracle she had performed. She checked on Andre, then sat by the window, watching the black SUV parked across the street. The door opened an hour later. Lorenzo walked in, looking like he'd been through a war. There was a smear of soot on his cheek and a dark stain on his white shirt that wasn't wine. He didn't say a word. He walked straight to her, his movements weary, and pulled her into his arms. Tasha felt the cold metal of the gun tucked into his waistband against her hip, a stark contrast to the warmth of his chest. She should have pushed him away. She should have demanded he leave her life. But as he buried his face in the crook of her neck, letting out a long, shuddering breath, she realized that she was the only place he could truly fall apart. "I had to see you," he whispered, his grip tightening. "I had to make sure the light was still here." Tasha pulled back just enough to look at him. She saw the exhaustion, the guilt, and the burgeoning love he was too afraid to name. She reached up, her dark fingers tracing the line of his jaw, wiping away the soot. Tasha looked into Lorenzo's eyes and saw the candle flickering. He was a man of shadows, but he was searching for the light she carried. "You can't keep doing this, Lorenzo," she said softly. "You can't live in both worlds." "Then show me how to leave the other one," he pleaded, his voice a raw confession. In the quiet of the South Side apartment, with the world outside burning and the guards watching from the street, the Mafia boss and the single mother found a common ground. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't safe, but it was the beginning of a bridge between two worlds that should never have met, a bridge built on the sight of a boy and the courage of a woman who refused to turn away. The dawn didn't bring peace. It brought the cold, hard reality of a war that had been simmering in the shadows of the Chicago docks. Lorenzo Moretti stood in the center of his sprawling mahogany study, the morning light catching the sharp, predatory lines of his face and the dark, blooming bruise along his ribs. He had spent the last 6 hours dismantling the crew that had dared to touch his shipments while he was distracted by his son's miracle. He had moved through the docks like a reaper, his hands stained with the grit of a world he had built on violence. But throughout the blood and the shouting, his mind had never truly left that Southside apartment. He could still feel the phantom warmth of Tasha's skin, the way she looked at him with eyes that didn't see a monster, but a man who was desperately trying to remember how to breathe. He turned as the terrace doors creaked open. Leo was sitting out there, draped in a heavy wool blanket, staring at Lake Michigan with an intensity that was almost painful to witness. The boy was pointing at everything, the white caps on the water, the way the gulls circled in the gray sky, the distant, shimmering silhouette of the Navy pier. Beside him sat Andre, Tasha's son. The two boys had formed an instant, quiet bond. Andre was explaining the world in the simple, honest terms of a child who had seen too much, but lost too little. "That's the blue, Leo. That's the color of the water when it's deep and the sky is clear," Andre said, pointing his finger toward the horizon. It's so much bigger than I imagined," Leo whispered, his voice full of a wonder that made Lorenzo's chest ache with a physical, crushing weight. For 10 years, he had tried to describe the world to his son, but his words had always felt like ash. Now, seeing the boy's eyes track the flight of a bird, Lorenzo felt the magnitude of what Tasha had given him. It wasn't just sight. It was the possibility of a life that didn't end in a blind alley. Lorenzo felt a presence behind him before he heard it. Tasha entered the room, still wearing her faded blue scrubs from a double shift at the hospital. She looked exhausted, her mahogany skin matte with fatigue, but she stopped dead when she saw him. Her obsidian eyes scanned his face, immediately landing on the bruise on his ribs and the small cut above his eye. She didn't ask what happened. She lived in Chicago. She knew that when men like Lorenzo Moretti went out at night, they didn't come back with just groceries. She walked to the medical kit she had left on the side table, her movements fluid and authoritative. "Sit," she commanded. Lorenzo obeyed. He, the man who commanded thousands, sat in the leather chair like a soldier reporting for duty. As she pressed a cold compress to his side, the air between them hummed with a dark, magnetic tension. It was the kind of silence that preceded a storm. Tasha's touch was clinical, but as her fingers grazed the heat of his skin, her breath hitched. The proximity was a dangerous drug. Lorenzo was a man built of scars and secrets, and Tasha was the only person who had ever dared to look at the wounds instead of the crown. He watched her intently. She was so different from the women who usually occupied his world, women who sought his power or feared his temper. Tasha sought nothing but his son's health. She stood there, a black woman with the weight of the world on her shoulders, looking at him with a mixture of desire and a terrifying kind of honesty. "You went back to the docks," Tasha said, her voice a low, steady vibration. "I had to secure the perimeter, Tasha. My world doesn't stop turning because your world gave me a miracle." Lorenzo growled, his hand moving to cover hers, pinning it against his chest. He wanted her to feel the heavy, erratic thrum of his heart. "They thought I was weak because I was distracted. I had to show them that a father's love isn't a vulnerability, it's a weapon. I have spent my life building a fortress around my son, and I won't let some bottom feeder tear it down just because the sun finally came out." Tasha looked at him, her expression a heartbreaking mix of hope and terrifying realism. "Is that what you call it? A weapon? Lorenzo, you're trying to build a bridge between the blood and the light, but you're still standing knee-deep in the blood. You can't keep one hand on a gun and the other on your son's hand and expect him to stay clean." "Then pull me out," he whispered, his voice raw and stripped of its usual bravado. He pulled her closer until she was standing between his knees, her scrubs brushing against his dark denim. "I've spent 10 years in a tomb, Tasha. I've forgotten how to be anything other than the Iron Boss. But when you look at me, I feel the fire again. Not the one that burns warehouses, but the one that keeps a man alive. You walked into that store and saw a child in pain, but you also saw me. You saw the ghost I'd become." He reached up, his thumb tracing the fullness of her lower lip. The desire was a living, breathing entity in the room, thick enough to choke on. This wasn't a vanilla romance. It was a collision of two souls who had been forged in fire. He kissed her then, a hard, desperate claim that tasted of salt, whiskey, and the lingering scent of rain. Tasha responded with a fierce hunger of her own, her hands tangling in his dark hair. She knew the danger of him. She knew that loving a man like Lorenzo Moretti was like holding a handful of broken glass, beautiful to look at, but guaranteed to make you bleed. Yet, as he pulled her onto his lap, she realized she was already too deep in the shadows to turn back. "I can't save you from yourself, Lorenzo," she murmured against his lips. "Just stay," he pleaded. "Stay until the morning feels real." The final resolution of the Moretti story didn't take place in the cold marble halls of the estate, or the sterile echoing corridors of the hospital. It took place on a Sunday evening in a small, sun-drenched park on the edge of the city, a patch of green that served as a neutral zone between the high-rises of the elite and the struggle of the South Side. Lorenzo Moretti sat on a weathered wooden bench, looking strangely human in a simple black polo shirt and dark jeans. The lethal edge was still there, tucked beneath the surface. But for the first time in his life, his shoulders weren't hunched against an invisible weight. Beside him sat Tasha, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand entwined with his. In the distance, Leo and Andre were running across the grass, their laughter a bright, silver sound that seemed to defy the heavy, violent history of the Moretti name. Leo was leading the way, his new eyes taking in every blade of grass, the way the sunset turned the clouds into streaks of violet and gold. He was no longer the boy who touched the walls to find his way. He was a boy who chased the light. Lorenzo watched them with an intensity that suggested he was memorizing the moment, fearing it might vanish if he blinked. He had begun the slow, agonizing process of dismantling his criminal empire, shifting his assets into legitimate shipping and construction. It had cost him a king's ransom, in exit taxes, to the other families. It had cost him the loyalty of men who only understood the language of the gun. He had survived an assassination attempt just 3 days prior, a bullet that had grazed his shoulder. But as he watched Leo kick a soccer ball toward Andre, he felt a peace that no amount of power or blood money could ever buy. "He's finally seeing the world," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a soft, intimate register. "But I think I'm the one who was truly blind, Tasha. I was looking at the gold in the territory, thinking that was how I protected him. I was missing the only thing that mattered. I thought I was a god in this city, but I was just a blind man wandering in a palace." Tasha squeezed his hand, her thumb tracing the deep scars on his knuckles, reminders of a past he was trying to outrun. "We all have our blind spots, Lorenzo. Some of us just need a grocery store miracle to clear the view. You were so busy looking for enemies that you forgot to look at the person right in front of you." She thought about that rainy Tuesday, the moment she saw a boy in pain and a father in despair. She realized then that God doesn't ask us for our credentials, or our bank statements, or a list of our virtues. He doesn't care about the sins of the past when the present is calling for help. He asks for eyes that refuse to look away. He asks for the courage to step into the path of a monster to save a child. She had stepped out of her world and into his, and in doing so, she had bridged a gap that everyone said was uncrossable. Lorenzo turned to her, his gaze holding a molten, protective love that made Tasha's breath hitch. "I used to think my life was a curse. That Leo's darkness was the price I had to pay for my father's sins and my own. I thought I was marked, Tasha. I didn't realize the darkness was just the tunnel I had to crawl through to find you. You are the only person who ever saw the man behind the mask." Tasha leaned up and kissed the corner of his mouth, the scent of him cedar and strength filling her senses. "The tunnel is behind us, Lorenzo. But the light is a daily choice. It's not a miracle that happens once. It's a miracle you have to wake up and decide to keep every single day. Can you do that? Can you choose the light even when the shadows start calling you back?" Lorenzo looked at his son, then back at the woman who had saved them both. "As long as you're standing in it, I'll never go back to the dark." As the sun dipped below the Chicago skyline, casting long amber shadows over the park. The Mafia boss and the single mother sat in the quiet. They were two broken people trying to build a bridge between worlds that were never meant to meet. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't entirely safe. There would always be ghosts in Lorenzo's past and struggles in Tasha's future. The city would always have its secrets, and the Moretti name would always carry a weight. But as they watched their sons play in the fading light, they knew they were no longer alone in the dark. For Leo, the miracle was the sight of the sun and the colors of the world. For Lorenzo, the miracle was the sight of a future he didn't have to kill for a future where he could be seen. And for Tasha, the miracle was the realization that a heart that doesn't turn away is the most powerful force on earth. The Iron Boss had been melted, the medic had found her home, and together, they walked out of the shadows and into the long-awaited morning. It was a story born in a grocery store aisle, but it was a story that would echo through the streets of Chicago for generations. Thanks for watching. Comment, like, and subscribe for more interesting stories.